Hello everyone. Today I'm going to be talking about my recent trip to Greenland. In March I went to Ilulissat, which is on the western coast of Greenland, for the very first time. This location has been on my to-do list as a photographer for many years because of the enormous icebergs which are floating in Disko Bay and in the Icefjord. And I finally got the chance to do it. This has been a trip that's been a long time in the making. In 2020 I was going to the area, but unfortunately we all know what happened in 2020. So my plans got postponed, and then in 2021 I decided to go there again. And about 2 weeks before my trip, everything got cancelled yet again because of changes in the border regulations in Greenland. So when I saw an offer from Iceland Air to travel to Ilulissat for 5 days, I was really excited about it. I pretty much instantly bought tickets. The only catch was it was going to be cold. It was going to be in March, and the temperatures that I had on this trip were between -21 and -28 degrees Celsius, so really cold. The biggest question in advance was, how was I going to prepare for this cold? Because I live in Iceland, and in Iceland it gets very cold, but it doesn't get that cold. So I decided to go to my Instagram and ask a bunch of people for advice, and I got a lot of really good tips, some really obvious, some not so obvious. One of the things that I purchased after getting a tip was a balaclava, because you want to protect your face, you want to protect your nose, because it's really cold. Even though you don't feel cold, your nose and your face will get very cold. Then I got double gloves. I had merino liners to put inside much thicker winter gloves. Then I had, of course, merino wool layers, which I have from using here in Iceland. I also got a really good tip that you can put thin socks on your feet, then put plastic bags over them, and then put wool socks over your feet. So the moisture inside of your socks stays trapped. And this is a really good way to keep your feet warm. I tried it every single day. It worked really well, so really good tip. Another tip I got was to use insulated insoles. And these are actually insoles with an aluminium bottom, which shields your feet from the cold coming from the ground. And then there's a thin wool layer on top of them, which also gives you a little bit of additional warmth. This works really well as well. I'm really happy that I got these insoles. They're very cheap and definitely worth it. After getting all these tips, I was pretty much ready to go. And I packed all of my stuff, went to the airport, and I was a little bit in denial that this was going to happen because I've been disappointed so many times before. And when I finally sat on the plane and the plane doors closed, this felt like a really big relief to me. While sitting on the plane, I kept constantly looking through the window, but there was nothing to see. It was too cloudy. But then when we arrived, or almost arrived at Ilulissat, and we were approaching the airport over Disko Bay, I could see the massive icebergs down below, and this was unbelievable. I think this is by far the most impressive approach I've ever made in my life. Like, you're flying towards the airstrip, and at the same time you can see these giant icebergs floating around in the ocean, and you can see all the shapes and patterns. And it made me a little bit sad that I picked the seat on the airplane which had the dirtiest window. But you know, I was going to get better photos later on, but this was really impressive. Then after arriving, I was really happy that I got my gloves and my hat, and I didn't put it far away in my bag because it was really cold. The first day, temperatures dropped to minus 22 degrees, and this was interesting to experience for the first time. After I arrived to the hotel, I immediately changed into different clothes, dressed myself really warm, and started walking towards the Icefjord. The hike there is about 20 to 30 minutes, depending on how fast you walk. And it was really impressive. Once you get to the UNESCO Icefjord Center, you can immediately see the icebergs flowing in the background, and this was impressive. I just kept stopping and looking, and after a while I reached a sort of lookout point, and this was where I decided I was going to sit down and have a look. And the first 10 to 15 minutes I kind of just stared in front of me. I just stared at the iceberg, stared at the sea ice floating in the ocean, and I was just overwhelmed. It's such a big and vast location, and additionally I was overwhelmed by the silence, and this was something I was not expecting. The silence was real silence, like actual silence. I could not hear anything. There was no sound from wind, from the ice cracking, from the ocean, birds or seals or any other kind of animals or people, because I was also alone there, which I only realized at that moment when I didn't hear anything. And this I have never experienced before. This silence, it was almost deafening, and it really made you realize that there's always sound around you. And after sitting there and listening to this, I was going to fly over the icebergs to capture the ice from above, and it almost felt like a crime making sound there. But once my drone got out over the ocean, you couldn't really hear it anymore. And these first few moments with the drone, they were just impressive. I made one of my bucket list shots that I wanted to make, which is just a top-down shot of the iceberg, and then you can see the ice going into the water, and you see all these different shades of blue. Made that the first few minutes. And then after that, I started flying through the icebergs and alongside of them, and this was just unbelievable. Here are some of the photographs I made during this first stay next to the Icefjord. The next couple of days I had made very little plans. The only thing that I had planned was to photograph the sunsets every evening, and I had also booked a boat trip on every single day. The reason why I did that is because I was told in advance that the ice, even though it's winter and even though there's not a lot of movement, the ice does change quite a bit. The big icebergs stay the same, but the ice moving in between the icebergs changes rapidly. And this turned out to be a really good idea because I went on 3 different trips and had 3 totally different conditions. The first day I went on a boat trip, the conditions were more interesting because of the light. The reason for that was that the air was much colder than the ocean water, which caused vapor to rise up from the water. And this gave a really nice effect with the sun. The second boat trip was probably my most favorite out of all three. The reason for that was that the conditions had changed completely. And this meant that because there was no wind, the sea ice had started closing again, and this created a sort of mirror-like texture on the ocean water. And while we were sailing in between the icebergs, you could see all of the massive icebergs being almost perfectly reflected into the water. And this created a lot of photo opportunities. I mostly used my 14 to 35 millimeter on this boat tour because I thought it was really nice to just hang over the side of the boat, tilt my camera about 40 degrees down, and then just photograph the foreground with the background. This created a lot of really special photographs. The third trip was probably the least impressive, but it was still interesting because I started focusing on different things. In the beginning I was focusing mostly on the ice, and now I changed my approach and started focusing a lot on the bird life around the ice, because I felt this gave a really interesting perspective to the size of it. One thing that you have to understand is that it's very difficult to create scale in photographs because there is no one else out there. There are a few fishing boats and that's it. There is no way to incorporate scale unless you use the birds. And I decided to focus a lot on the birds on that trip, and especially the ravens, because they are pure black. It's really interesting to see how they stick out against the white landscape. Here are a couple of my favorite photographs, and I hope you agree that it's interesting how this adds some scale to them. So what gear did I use? I don't have a lot of gear. That's the first thing I want to say. And I only own 2 lenses. I currently own 2 camera bodies and a drone, and that's it. I don't feel like I need more. I used to have a lot of different equipment, and I felt like this was getting in my way because I was spending a lot of time on deciding what I was going to use and less time trying to figure out perspectives and finding angles to photograph. So the drone that I use is a DJI Air 2S, which is rated for going down to temperatures of 0 degrees. I flew well below 0 degrees. I think the coldest one was -28 at one point, and this drone performed really well. The only thing that I can advise is the batteries. It's a good idea to keep them nice and warm. I put them in wool socks, and this kept the batteries pretty much at room temperature even while I was outside in the cold. And this is a really big advantage because otherwise you need to spend time heating up the battery by having the motors run, and you lose battery time. Another thing that I used is the 100 to 500, which I've already shown you. This is one of my favorite lenses, and I feel like it worked really well. especially in combination with the 14 to 35, which I'm filming this video on. It worked really well. The reason for that was the 14 to 35. It gave me a really unique perspective where I could just hang over the side of the boat and tilt the camera down and then incorporate the foreground and the background to create a really unique photograph. During the whole trip, I didn't feel like I needed this range that I am missing. I don't use the range between 35 and 100 millimeter, and I didn't feel like I needed it on this trip either. All of this equipment worked really well, even at such low temperatures. The only thing that I would advise for is that you need to be careful to not breathe too much on your equipment. I had at one point, my breath had frozen to the screen, so I couldn't really see what was on the screen anymore. So imagine if you breathe on the front of your lens, it will just freeze and there is no way to get this off of your lens while you're outside because it's too cold. And the same with the drone, don't breathe on it, keep this as warm as possible. Usually having everything inside of your bag is enough, but if you're a little bit afraid that it might be too cold, it's good to just put things in a wool sock or even put hand warmers in your camera bag. So that's it for this video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, give it a thumbs up. If you didn't, give it a thumbs down. Please subscribe to my channel. It's a great way to support my work. The next video will be about the most recent eruption in Iceland, which took place last year. I extensively documented this eruption. I even wrote a book about it, which is called New Earth. We'll be talking about it in my next video, so stay tuned. If you're interested in more of my work, please go to my website. I have a great blog there, also a blog about Greenland. I have galleries, and I also have a list of upcoming workshops which will take place this and next year. There's a great variety in them. Some take place in Iceland and some in Greenland. So maybe I will see you there next time. Bye.